The Mexican state of Oaxaca has a rich pre Columbian history and a thriving indigenous heritage that continues to the present day. In fact, it's estimated that a third of the inhabitants of Oaxaca speak an indigenous language. Here you can find a mosaic of different peoples and languages, like the Mixtec, Chatinos, Miches, Mazatecs, Zoques, each with their own rich history and culture. Today, however, we are going to focus on one group in particular, the Zapotec. Who are the Zapotec? The Zapotec are the largest group of indigenous people in Oaxaca, still thriving today as their ancestors did long ago. They and their indigenous neighbors in Oaxaca have a long history in Mesoamerica with many impressive achievements that often fly under the radar outside of Mexico. They were among the first people in the Americas to domesticate plants and live in permanent settlements. They were also early adopters of writing, using their very own script, and they built some of the earliest large urban centers in Mesoamerica. Their most famous city is Monte Albán. Even if you've never heard of the Zapotecs, there's a decent chance you've heard of or seen pictures from Monte Albán. Today, its empty ruins tower over the modern city of Oaxaca. We've seen plenty of plazas, pyramids, platforms, and ball courts before, but never painstakingly constructed at the very top of a beautiful mountain. That scenery is tough to beat. Monte Albán represents the crowning achievement of early Zapotec history and draws hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. In this video, we are going to examine the origins of Zapotec culture and the rise of Monte Albán. Let's take a look at where we'll be spending this episode, the Valley of Oaxaca. The valley is located in the highlands of Oaxaca, a region about 1,500 meters or 5,000 feet above sea level at the valley floor. The valley is shaped like an upside down Y and has three branches. The largest of these branches is the Valle Grande to the south. Not only does it have the most arable land on the valley floor, but it typically receives more rain than the other branches and has a higher water table. In this branch, farmers can even dry farm without irrigation. To the north is the Etla branch. This is the most narrow branch, and while it's pretty dry, its geography lends itself nicely to irrigation. To the east is the Tlacalula branch, which receives less rain and is more difficult to irrigate. At the center of the valley is a series of low mountains that rise out of the valley. They'll become important later. The Valley of Oaxaca is dominated by slopes and hillsides. In fact, less than a sixth of the land is flat or gently sloping, which limits the amount of arable land. Rainfall in the valley is frustratingly variable and not always predictable, which can make agriculture challenging. On average, rainfall averages about 550 millimeters, 22 inches, to 900 millimeters, 35 inches, depending on the topography and elevation. The year is divided into a dry season beginning in October and ending in May, and a wet season from June to September. However, much of the rain is lost due to evaporation or transpiration from vegetation, which makes water management a high priority for the inhabitants of the valley. Speaking of vegetation, the valley floor is dominated by grasses, shrubs, and small trees like mesquite. Higher up in the Piedmont, you can find cactus and oak, and higher yet, the mountainsides are dominated by pine forests and oak. Okay, now that we can appreciate the beautiful locale, let's take a brief look at human occupation in the Valley of Oaxaca. The valley does have sites that date back as late as the Paleo-Indian period around 11,000 years ago, but we start to get a clearer picture of the inhabitants around the Archaic period. Archaic sites are few and far between in the valley compared to later eras, which suggests that human populations were low. However, this was still an important time because it's when certain plants in Mesoamerica, such as squash, maize, beans, and chilies, began to be domesticated. In fact, the earliest discovered maize cobs and domesticated squash were actually discovered just outside the Valley of Oaxaca, which makes it a very important region in the history of crop domestication in Mesoamerica. That said, plant domestication wasn't a sudden event, and it wasn't life-changing when it began. Domesticates made up a small portion of diets during the Archaic period, but by the end of that period, these foods took on increasingly greater roles in the diet. One way we can see this is in the increase in grinding technologies, such as manos y metates, which were, and still are, used to process plant foods. The Archaic period ends at 2000 BCE and transitions into the Preclassic period. Quick note, many authors use the term formative instead of Preclassic when discussing Oaxacan archaeology. Both terms refer to the same time period, though, and are interchangeable. I've used Preclassic in most of my other Mesoamerican videos, so I'm going to employ it here. Just be aware in case you decide to crack open a book on the topic later. During the early Preclassic, life began to change in Oaxaca. Between 1900 BCE and 1400 BCE, the first signs of sedentary life began to appear. This is when we see the earliest permanent settlements, storage facilities, and the earliest pottery, which makes these people much more archaeologically visible than their Paleo and Archaic ancestors. The earliest pottery in the valley that we have evidence for consists of simple and undecorated brown or buff bowls and jars. Most early Preclassic sites contain about 5 to 10 households, each containing a small family group, although a few examples of larger communities also date to this time, and we'll discuss one of them soon. Looking at the archaeology of this time, it's clear that Zapotec society was egalitarian. That's not to say that there were no differences between people. Even though people were eating the same foods and living in the same kinds of houses, we do see signs of prestige among certain individuals. One place where this is very evident is in tombs from the period. High prestige burials can be found with decorated ceramic vessels, magnetite mirrors, and jade artifacts, and the people buried in such tombs were more likely to have had deformed skulls. This was widely practiced in Mesoamerica, and even in North and South America as well, and it's believed that in Oaxaca it may have been a status symbol. Prestige can also be identified by exotic materials from outside the valley that certain households had access to through social networks. Such items would have included marine shells from the Pacific and Atlantic coasts, foreign pottery, jade from the Maya area, bloodletting instruments, and most importantly, obsidian from sources outside the valley. Obsidian was so prevalent that it has been found in all households, and analysis has shown that at this time, it was being imported from as far away as the Gulf Coast and the Valley of Mexico. Households and families could use these trade connections to enhance their prestige, and archaeology has shown that everyone had access to various exotic materials for crafting. No household ever controlled a single resource or craft industry. Now, while we're on the subject of foreign connections, we need to talk about the Olmec. We've already got an episode on the Olmec, but just to summarize, the Olmec were a people and culture living to the north on the Gulf Coast in modern-day Veracruz and Tabasco. They played a pivotal role in spreading a lot of cultural staples in Mesoamerica, such as urban design, the sacred calendar, writing, and a distinct artistic tradition. That's not to say that they invented all of these, but they really popularized them. The Olmec influence had a profound effect across much of Mesoamerica, and the Zapotec were one of the eager recipients of that influence. So it's no surprise that we start seeing imported Olmec items like pottery and stingray spines for auto-sacrifice. The Zapotec also began creating imitation Olmec pottery and appropriating Olmec symbols. This would have lent a lot of prestige to their owners. Remember, the Olmec were living in full-blown cities, while the Zapotec were living in small agricultural villages. I imagine this would be the equivalent of someone in a small town trading their old boots for footwear made from finely crafted leather. Now it's time for us to turn our attention to a certain settlement in the Valley of Oaxaca. No, not Monte Albán, not yet. That's still on the horizon. Don't worry, we'll get there soon, but this is important. Instead, we are talking about the site of San José Mogote, located in the modern town of San José El Mogote. Don't ask me why the archaeological literature drops the L. I went on a bit of a goose chase trying to find the answer and came up empty. Anyways, this lovely little town in the Etla branch dates back to about 1300 BCE. Originally a small village, it became the preeminent settlement in the valley in the following centuries, covering 70 hectares with a population that was 10 times larger than the next village. This is in large part due to the irrigation works constructed by the community, which allowed it to become very prosperous. San José Mogote even had grand public architecture. It may not look like much today, but compared to most other sites in the valley, this was a big deal. At 800 BCE, the site had an 18-meter wide terraced pyramidal platform that was 2 meters high with 2 staircases. Current evidence suggests that this was not the home of an elite residence, but rather a non-residential ceremonial space for the community. After 800 BCE, however, things began to change both at San Jose Mogote and the valley as a whole. There was social reorganization in the valley of Oaxaca that accompanied increased population growth and an elaboration of settlements. This wasn't unique to Oaxaca, this was a trend across much of Mesoamerica. During the Middle Preclassic, the population of the valley boomed. Between 800 BCE and 300 BCE, the Valley of Oaxaca saw a ninefold increase in population, and this led to much greater social complexity. The Middle Preclassic is also when we start seeing increasingly stark distinctions between elites and commoners, more large settlements, and a rise in competition and warfare between those settlements. To see an example of this broader shift in how life was changing, let's turn back to San Jose Mogote and see the shift up close. First of all, we see signs of an emerging and hereditary nobility at the site. This can be seen in elite residences that began to be constructed, and the construction of stone masonry tombs. The nobility at San Jose Mogote, whether through force or social influence, began to commission grander public architecture. We can see this in the construction of Building 1, a small but impressive acropolis with a series of temples and public residences that would have not only linked the nobility to the center of ceremonial life, but also upscaled public ceremonies. This new construction is very important for another reason. Monument 3. This unassuming monument is the proverbial stone that kills not one, not two, but three birds. Let's pull up a drawing so we can see this better. It depicts what most scholars agree is a tortured and probably sacrificed captive. If you look between his legs, you'll notice a glyph that reads "one earthquake." This is the first recorded example of the Mesoamerican calendar, human sacrifice, and Zapotec writing all on one monument for our convenience. Dating for this guy is a bit contested. Even though it has a date glyph, it does not include a long count date, so there's no way to assign it to a specific year. That said, it likely dates from between 700 to 500 BCE. Also, just a quick note, the glyph "one earthquake" is not likely referring to the date of an event, but rather the name of an individual who was probably sacrificed. But why was the city suddenly sacrificing people and commemorating it? Well, to appreciate that, we need to look at other changes that were happening in the valley during this time. As it turns out, San Jose Mogote wasn't the only site in the valley enjoying success. Other centers, such as Yagua in the Tlacalula branch and settlements near Tilcahete in the Valle Grande, were growing and were building public architecture with smaller surrounding communities tied to them. The valley was really coming alive. However, archaeology suggests that relations between these sites were a bit rocky because we see evidence for destroyed buildings. Around 600 BCE, archaeology shows that San Jose Mogote's Structure 28 in the ceremonial center was burned to the ground, and then subsequently rebuilt. At Tilcahete, their ceremonial center was burned around 300 BCE. Interestingly, the foreign trade that we noted in the previous period slowed down noticeably, with the exception of obsidian, which continued to be exchanged widely. Either way, competition was getting fierce, and with this in mind, we can see Monument 3 in a new light. Mr. One Earthquake here was probably a high-ranking captive from another polity that was publicly executed in the ceremonial center. Warfare aside, the valley was growing, and settlements and society were growing more and more sophisticated. You might think of the Middle Preclassic as something of a golden age for San Jose Mogote, but most of these actually were centuries of demographic decline for the site, even as they built their most famous monuments. What was causing this decline and disruption? At 500 BCE, the valley was in a bit of a political crisis. Archaeologist and anthropologist Arthur Joyce lists 4 factors that motivated the demographic decline of San Jose Mogote, and we've already mentioned 2, but let's list them out here. Warfare, disruption in long-distance trade, the rise of a new religious movement, and social tensions and conflict rising from hereditary status distinctions. The result of all this was for the people of San Jose Mogote and other communities to come together and make a fresh start. To this end, they set their sights on the central hills in the valley and began construction of a new city, the scale of which the valley had never seen, the city that we know today as Monte Albán. A few quick words about that name. We do not know the ancient name of the city. The traditional Zapotec name for the site is Daniban, which means sacred mountain, but no one is exactly sure how far back in time that name goes. The modern name, Monte Alban, is believed to come from the Spanish term Monte Albino, which means white mountain. This in turn is thought to refer to the white flowers of the trees that covered the site before it was excavated and restored. For ease, we'll be sticking with the Spanish name throughout the episode. Before we discuss the city itself and its foundation, let's look at Monte Alban's location. The city is located on a hilltop rising 300 meters or 980 feet from the valley floor, almost right where the three branches of the Valley of Oaxaca converge. This is a commanding, defensible, and spectacular location. When you're on the summit, you get an incredible view across the valley in all directions. I mean, just imagine waking up in the morning to this. It's likely that this was also a site that held religious or spiritual significance as well, and would have lent its rulers legitimacy. On the other hand, this was also a challenging place to build a major city. Mountaintops do not offer an easy or forgiving landscape for urban planning. To make this city possible, they had to flatten the top of the mountain to make a level surface for the city. No small task there, as anyone who's ever had to level hilly terrain in Minecraft can tell you. Arable land is also limited, which means that a lot of the food had to be transported from the valley floor, as well as any craft or building materials not available on the mountain. You'll sometimes read in the literature that almost no water was available on the mountain. While water is scarce on the mountain today, recent research has confirmed that there were mountain streams and a spring in the past that could produce a local water supply on the mountain slopes. These would have fed canals and reservoirs for crops and domestic use. But back to the city's foundation. Around 500 BCE, the people of San Jose Mogote began to move to Monte Alban and to build the new capital that would become the premier city in the Valley of Oaxaca. Some of you may be wondering why scholars believe that the people of San Jose Mogote were the ones building Monte Alban, and that's a fair question. First, Monte Alban's population increases as San Jose Mogote's decreases. Second, there are important similarities in material culture and architecture between late San Jose Mogote and early Monte Alban, so archaeologists are pretty confident that these people were moving to Monte Alban in droves. But they weren't the only ones. Monte Alban quickly eclipsed the size and population of San Jose Mogote and continued to swell, so other people in the valley were also clearly drawn to the new city for one reason or another. The foundation of Monte Alban was not a gradual process, but a sudden event that immediately changed the trajectory of the valley. It was growing rapidly. Modern estimates put the growth of Monte Alban during its first period at 6% per year, which is a rate much higher than that of developing nations today. By 300 BCE, the move was complete and San Jose Mogote was completely abandoned, while Monte Alban was thriving with a population of about 5,000 people. 200 years later, it had more than tripled to over 17,000 people. So what exactly was being built at the site? Let's zoom in so that we can get an appreciation of Monte Alban. The city is dominated by the main plaza, which measures 300 meters by 150 meters, or for people who don't use the metric system, about the size of 8 football fields. It's hard to put into words how massive this space is, but if you ever visit the site, and I hope that you do someday, you'll be blown away. Just look at how tiny the people are in this picture. To construct the plaza, the top of the mountain had to be made level by removing outcrops and filling in hollows, which must have involved huge labor demands. In later centuries, the plaza surface was later plastered over with stucco. This would have been a massive ceremonial space that would have allowed huge numbers of people to gather. It's also possible that it may have functioned as a marketplace for the city, but this is speculation. Like many other ancient cities, the architecture and layout of the main plaza were likely a reflection of the Zapotec cosmos. Remember, this mountain was probably a sacred place long before the city was built. Okay, let's discuss some of the interesting buildings around the main plaza. But before we start, I have 2 quick points. First, although many of these buildings and structures have been restored to varying degrees, they are still in a degraded state. During the city's lifetime, they would have been plastered and painted in vibrant colors, particularly red and white. You can see a building reconstruction here that really captures the vibe if you multiply it over and over. Had you seen the city back then in person, you would have been dazzled. Centuries of neglect, rain, and overgrowth have sadly worn almost all of it away. Just keep in mind that this would have looked a lot different. Second, Monte Albán is more than just the plaza and ceremonial center. Beyond this area, there was a lot of space devoted to common people. On the slopes of the mountain would have been hundreds of terraces supporting houses, roads, ball courts, defensive walls, and reservoirs. This would have been where most of the population at the site would have lived and worked. At the base of the mountain, there also would have been settlements as well, supplying food, materials, and goods to the city. Okay, with those out of the way, let's take a quick tour of the city. Starting north, we begin at the northern Acropolis. This platform is accessed by a main stairway that leads to what was once a colonnaded vestibule. North of this is the sunken court, which is really interesting because it's another ceremonial space that is cut off from the main plaza, likely reserved for elites. Northeast of the court is the VG complex, which includes several large platforms that crown the northern Acropolis. Like the sunken court, it's believed that this area was reserved for city elites given its position. Working clockwise, we have the main ball court. This is done in the traditional Mesoamerican style with the classic I shape. Ball courts were important buildings in all major Mesoamerican cities and towns, and Monte Albán was no exception. Ball games were not only for recreation. They held deep ritual meaning for Mesoamericans and were even a feature in the mythology of some cultures. Some of you steely-eyed viewers may have noticed that there are no rings like we see in a lot of other ball courts. This is actually fairly normal in ball courts of the period in Oaxaca. Although this ball court isn't the only one at the site, it is the only one that's on the main plaza. Continuing south down the eastern side are a series of buildings: Building 2, Building P, the Palace, and Mound Q. For those interested in what the palace is, it was an elite residence, but probably not the residence of the city rulers. What makes scholars say that? It's because no tombs have been found below the building. The Zapotecs, like many other Mesoamerican people, buried their dead under their homes. Thus, the absence of tombs in this building has led to speculation that it might have been a house for foreign dignitaries or ambassadors. In front of Building P is what archaeologists refer to as the shrine, which was likely a ceremonial platform used to hold water for water-related ceremonies. It's also famous for being the spot where this beautiful bat god crafted from jade was recovered. Excavations have also discovered two small tunnels that link it to Building H in the plaza center. On the southern end of the plaza is the southern platform. This large platform is 120 meters by 112 meters and 11 meters high. On top are two temples, but along the sides of the platform are groups of carvings of captives that document some of the city's military history. On the west side, we have System M, Building L, which is famous for its danzante carvings that we'll discuss later, and finally Building K. The center of the plaza is characterized by four buildings running north to south: Buildings G, H, I, and J. You might have noticed that Building J looks a little out of place with that alignment, and it's worth some extra discussion. While all the other buildings and monuments are lined up really nicely, this one is noticeably oblique, pointing to the southwest. What's going on here? Anthony Aveni, a specialist in ancient archaeoastronomy, has devoted a lot of study to this. He has proposed that this has astronomical alignments, specifically with the star Capella during zenith passage, and for this reason, it's sometimes called the observatory. Aveni bolsters this claim based on an aligned zenith passage tube found in Building P. What's a zenith passage and what's a zenith passage tube? For those like me who are stuck living north of the tropics, solar zenith is when the sun passes directly overhead and casts a shadow directly below you, and it allows you to get some wild shadowless experiences like this. In Building P, there's a hole in the staircase into which the sun will cast a beam straight down during solar zenith in early May and early August, and it's believed by some that this was an important calendrical function. However, others have pushed back on this. Damon Peeler and Marcus Winter have done their own measurements and come up with slightly different azimuths and dispute Aveni's interpretation. They have instead suggested that the building is a calendar temple. That said, I think it's fair to say that the astronomical interpretation remains the most popular in the literature for now, but that could always change. Stay tuned, kids. What's most interesting about the Central Plaza is that we know that it didn't always have this design and layout. What you see today is simply the final design before the city was abandoned. So what did this look like before buildings G, H, I, and J were built? A recent archaeological project has actually given us a fascinating glimpse into the early design of the plaza. To make a long story short, this survey used ground penetrating radar and measured electrical resistance, and using the results, were able to find traces of former structures underground. In this image, you can see several platforms and columns aligned on an east west axis. These were dubbed the PGMA complex by the team. The only remaining structure appears to be the shrine, although there may be others under the other buildings in the plaza center. Really cool. Now, the team doesn't say this in the study, and this is purely my speculation, so please take this with a grain of salt, as I am not a professional archaeologist, only a man who spends too much time in front of books and computer monitors. Please send help. To my eyes, these structures look a lot like an E group that we see in pre-classic Maya and Olmec cities. For those who have watched our episode on the Maya Preclassic, you'll remember that an E group is an arrangement of platforms that feature a large temple flanked by a long platform that usually has 3 structures built on it. These E groups typically have astronomical or geographical alignments. Here's one at the Maya site of Oaxaca, for example. If that is indeed the case, it fits in really nicely with the urban design across pre-classic Mesoamerica, particularly in the areas that drew a lot of inspiration from the Olmec, and it suggests that these areas had continued to share ideas about sacred space and urban design. You might be wondering why this layout was abandoned, and to discuss that, we need to look at the early history of Monte Albán. Monte Albán's pre-classic history is a story of rising power, influence, and conquest. By 300 BCE, Monte Albán was far and away the largest city in the valley, and it would have completely dwarfed second place. As we mentioned earlier, the Middle Preclassic was a time that was rife with conflict, and Monte Albán was now the biggest player on the court. What happens when you're the biggest guy on the court with a bunch of kids? You dunk. So it shouldn't be a surprise that we see signs of warfare and conquest at Monte Albán. Most scholars believe that the years between 300 and 100 BCE saw Monte Albán expand its control from its immediate hinterlands to most of, if not all of, the Valley of Oaxaca. This allowed the rulers of Monte Albán to gain control of important resources in the valley. It also ensured a stable food supply. Remember what I mentioned earlier, Monte Albán could not produce enough food to sustain itself. That's the price of living on top of a scenic mountain. Thus, it depended on food provided by communities on the valley floor. Monte Albán's influence is also visible across the valley, and we see similar architecture and Monte Albán-style grayware pottery begin to show up in huge numbers at different sites during this time period. This spreading influence came with a lot of conflict. Although a lot of people, commoners, and nobles alike bought into the idea of Monte Albán and fueled its growth, there were clearly people in cities that preferred independence from Monte Albán, perhaps seeing it as an upstart and a bully. A good example of conquest and warfare in the valley can be seen at the site of El Mogote in the Valle Grande, not to be confused with San Jose Mogote in the Etla Valley. It appears to have been an independent site, and a good-sized one at 53 hectares. Archaeologists believe that this was independent from Monte Albán based on El Mogote's unique city layout and the lack of shared ceramics with Monte Albán. Evidence shows that at 300 BCE, the site was attacked and its ceremonial precinct burned, and the community relocated to a more defensible position on an 800-meter high hill to the west called El Palenque, not to be confused with Palenque, the famous Maya site. No confusing names here, folks. Like its rival Monte Albán, El Palenque had plazas, platforms, and elite residences, and possibly defensive walls, although archaeologists aren't positive. Unfortunately, El Palenque met the same fate as El Mogote and was destroyed around 20 BCE. The next large city in the area, Tilcahete, was built after the fall of El Palenque, and it shows unmistakable influence from Monte Albán. By all appearances, it looks like these people were officially getting with the program. There's some debate about whether or not Monte Albán conquered or occupied any areas outside the valley, and whether or not it was the seat of an empire or just the capital of a large valley-wide Zapotec kingdom. There is some evidence of Zapotec activity outside the Valley of Oaxaca. To the south, the Sola Valley shows a buildup of settlements during this time, and the presence of grayware pottery and Zapotec architecture shows that these were Zapotec settlements. Prior to the Preclassic, there was no substantial human presence in the valley, but as Monte Albán grew in size and influence, the Sola Valley began to be settled. This would have been a strategic valley to control, or at least to be on very good terms with to ensure access to the southern coast. Scholars have also argued that similar patterns can be seen in neighboring regions, such as the Cañada to the north, but the evidence is mixed and the degree to which Monte Alban imperialism spread beyond the Valley of Oaxaca is still debated. Nonetheless, Monte Alban was certainly among the most powerful city-states in Mesoamerica. This military success was also celebrated in monuments at Monte Alban itself. Going back to Monte Alban, let's take a look at Building L, where we see several stone reliefs that were recovered during excavations of the structure. These reliefs are called danzantes. Nearly 400 of these have been found at Monte Alban, and they represent the vast majority of the monumental record at the site. Those of you who know your Spanish will know that danzantes means dancers, and that name was given to them by the archaeologists who originally excavated them. But are they really dancers? I'll bet a few of you may have noticed that they look very similar to our friend from Monument 3 of San José Mogote. So it shouldn't be a coincidence that the most common interpretation is that these figures, like our old friend One Earthquake, are sacrificial victims, most likely high-profile war captives, since many of these figures have names. As you can see, they are often naked and contorted, and a lot of them appear to have wounds, so this interpretation makes a lot of sense. Now, this isn't the only interpretation. Some have suggested that these are people in shamanic trances, or perhaps even illustrations of medical conditions. That said, my favorite alternate interpretation comes from well-known archaeologist and ancient Zapotec expert Javier Urcid, who suggests that these are depictions of high-ranking individuals participating in bloodletting. Now, for those who don't know how bloodletting or auto-sacrifice worked in ancient Mesoamerica, let me fill you in. My apologies if this is a bit graphic. A person would pierce their penis, ears, or tongue to draw blood, and collect that blood on a cloth or scroll of paper, and Urcid contends that this is what is being depicted here. What's odd about the danzantes is that most of them were not originally erected and displayed in Building L. Rather, they were likely displayed around the site before being moved to this area and then buried. Another important type of carved monument that appears at Monte Alban are what scholars refer to as the conquest slabs. There are about 50 of these slabs, and they usually depict a hill with a glyph over it, which is most likely the toponym of a city. Many also have an upside-down or decapitated head in the image, and some even have date signs as well, perhaps recording the date of a specific event or the name of a person. Scholars have tried to identify the places represented by these toponyms with little luck. Their names have simply been lost to history. Like the danzantes, we can tell that these have been moved from their original position and were reused in other construction, particularly with Building J. Keep in mind that when these were reused, they would have been covered up with stucco and would not have been visible to later residents, but we'll go into more detail about that shortly. Most scholars believe that they record conquests or victories by Monte Alban over rivals, but this isn't entirely certain. Others have suggested that these might be referring to mythological events. Some of you may have noticed that many of these monuments have glyphs and writing on them, so let's take a quick detour and discuss Zapotec writing. Like the Olmec and the Maya, the Zapotec had their own writing system, and it's actually the Zapotec that have provided us with the earliest significant corpus of writing in Mesoamerica. I came across one spicy claim that Zapotec writing is the earliest writing in Mesoamerica, but there are other instances of Olmec writing that are likely older, so I'd take that with a grain of salt. Regardless of whether or not that claim is true, Zapotec script is the earliest writing in Mesoamerica that we have in large volume, as opposed to the Olmecs, from whom we have very limited examples. Like the Maya, the script is logographic and pictographic. Zapotec script appears to have been pretty flexible, and there are examples of inscriptions running from top to bottom, left to right, and even right to left and bottom to up. Unfortunately, this script is mostly undeciphered. Javier Urcid, who we mentioned earlier, has made attempts to decipher the script, but has not made any significant breakthroughs. If any aspiring would-be Champoleons or Knorzovs are out there watching this and you want to make a name for yourselves, you can start learning Zapotec and take a stab at it. That said, we can read Zapotec calendar glyphs, which allow us to assign dates to inscriptions and allow us to read certain names. However, broader decipherment still awaits us. Zapotec writing unfortunately stopped being used after Monte Alban. or at least if it was only used on materials that have not survived. Those monuments and texts show us that the city was increasingly home to a powerful elite and ruling class. This can be seen in elite homes and tombs that can be found at the site. Such rulers would have had large decorated tombs with lots of grave goods and exotic materials. These elite also exerted a powerful religious influence as well. Human sacrifice began to be depicted like it was at San Jose Mogote, and it's likely that this was a practice controlled by the nobles, who alone would have had the resources and power to conduct raids, take captives, and host elaborate public ceremonies. Some of you in the audience have probably been wondering why these danzantes and conquest slabs were reused as construction material in later projects. That's because there appears to have been a change in management at Monte Albán around 1 or 200 CE. At that time, there's a shift in architecture and monuments. Archaeology also tells us that the nobles were gaining power and turning the plaza into an increasingly reserved space for their own purposes. This may have increased tensions and eventually boiled over into some sort of internal conflict. There's some evidence that this might have been violent because at one of the plaza entrances there have even been projectile points recovered, which suggests that things got heated. After this episode, there's a lot of changes on the plaza. Those danzantes and conquest slabs that had likely celebrated military victories of the leadership and sacrificial rituals were dismantled and reused in other construction. It's very likely those programs were shoved into the proverbial closet. Those early E-group structures from the PGMA complex were torn down, and the plaza was remade anew in the ensuing centuries. Whatever new leadership had taken over the city, they were ready to remake it in their own image. And that brings us to the Classic period at about 250 CE. This is really the peak of the city in terms of size and population, and when we see the nobility at Monte Albán really starting to flex. During this period, the valley population continued to increase, and it's estimated that it topped 100,000 people in the early Classic. By the late Classic, there were an estimated 150,000 people living in the valley. Not all of this growth was centered at Monte Albán, though. Other centers in the valley began to grow, and a few new centers such as Halietza and the city cluster of Dainzu, Maquixochit, Tlacochawaya, and Guadalupe even rivaled Monte Albán in size and population. They were also building large monumental architecture and are impressive sites in their own right. Their rise in the Classic period appears to have coincided with a contraction of Monte Albán's political authority in the valley. Most researchers agree that during the early Classic, Monte Albán gave up or lost control of certain areas that it had subjugated in the late Pre-Classic. The Classic picture is one of fragmenting political power. To be sure, Monte Albán was still the premier city of the valley with an estimated population of 22,000 during its final stage. That said, even if Monte Albán wasn't as dominant as it once was, it was still a force to be reckoned with, and it negotiated with other valley centers, sometimes violently. In discussing the Classic period at Monte Albán, we need to take a quick minute so that we can discuss the cultural heavyweight in Mexico at that time that was Teotihuacan. We've already covered this juggernaut in another episode, but to summarize, Teotihuacan was a massive and powerful city-state in the Valley of Mexico that took off in the late Pre-Classic and left a huge legacy across Mesoamerica in art, architecture, and religion. Teotihuacan's influence was pervasive all across Mesoamerica, even in the Maya region where they infamously deposed the king of Tikal and started a new dynasty at Copan. So it shouldn't be a surprise that Monte Albán was not immune from Teotihuacan's influence. The nature of Monte Albán and Teotihuacan's relationship has been the subject of debate for decades. We know from archaeology at Teotihuacan that there was a Zapotec barrio, where Zapotec people lived and maintained their identity. It's likely that these Zapotec residents were probably facilitating relations between the two states. Back at Monte Albán, pottery from the Valley of Mexico, as well as Teotihuacano figurines and ceramics, have been recovered in excavations, and a tomb of a possible Teotihuacano man has also been excavated. These were excavated from a specific part of the northern Acropolis, which some have suggested might have been a Teotihuacano quarter. Archaeologist Joyce Marcus has argued that certain carvings record visits from Teotihuacan ambassadors, but there's disagreement about those conclusions. One aspect of this Zapotec and Teotihuacan relationship that does have broad consensus is the trade of materials between the two groups. Mica from the Valley of Oaxaca was traded to Teotihuacan, even though the Zapotecs made no use of the mineral in their crafting. Teotihuacanos used mica in decorating braziers, and deposits of mica and tools to cut it have been found at Teotihuacan. In return, Monte Albán received obsidian from Teotihuacano sources in central Mexico. Teotihuacano style architecture, most visibly Tolude Tablero style platforms, show up at Monte Albán during the Classic period as well, though it's worth noting that these weren't adopted wholesale and were adapted to local Zapotec tastes. Some scholars have even suggested that the main plaza at Monte Albán was inspired by Teotihuacan's grand magnificence. It's clear that the two cities were in close contact and exchanging goods and ideas. Some archaeologists have proposed that Teotihuacan actually conquered Monte Albán at one point, but the lack of Teotihuacano garrisons and administrative facilities have cast a lot of doubt on that. Teotihuacan may have been a hegemon over Monte Albán and curbed its influence by exacting tribute from them, but again, direct evidence is lacking. More likely is that these two cities had a reciprocal economic and political relationship that was facilitated by parties in both cities. Some of you may be wondering if that turbulence at the end of the Preclassic that we mentioned earlier was caused by Teotihuacan, but the rise of the Zapotec nobility in later centuries suggests that it was internal. And on that note, we see a fluorescence of elite culture at Monte Albán. Classic art focused much more on political, religious, and military power of the nobility and the groups that they led. This is when the rulers of Monte Albán really come into focus as they accrued more power and wealth. We can see depictions of different rulers in the city's public art. Javier Urcid has documented at least 11 rulers on carved stones in the main plaza. A series of drinking vessels reference a Lord One Jaguar and his wife Lady Two Flower. It's possible that this one jaguar may have been a dynasty founder. Jaguar imagery is all over Monte Albán, and this has led some experts to suggest that the jaguar was an important symbol of the city. The jaguar may have even lent its name or symbol to the dynasty or the city in ancient times. Another early ruler from the early classic is Lord Five Jaguar. Javier Urcid argues that he commissioned a building with scenes of nobles commemorating him and his father, and that one of his successors, Lord 13 Knight, dismantled and later reused the materials to construct a larger building for himself. One of the carvings from this building shows a bound captive, clad in a jaguar pelt, indicating that he was probably an important lord from a competing city. Let's not think too hard about his fate. Funny enough, this building was also dismantled by a later ruler and the materials reused in the southern platform, where you can still see them today. This probably indicates that dynasties were changing and that earlier rulers were getting removed from the historical record. Another place where we can really see elite culture in detail is in elite tombs at Monte Albán. Over 200 tombs have been excavated at Monte Albán over the decades. As I mentioned earlier, Zapotec people buried their dead under their houses rather than in cemeteries, so these tombs acted as family crypts. They were regularly re-accessed to inter new family members and to be redecorated. The tomb would contain the remains of the family leader and his or her partner in the center of the tomb with valuable offerings. In fact, these tomb offerings represent some of the most famous Zapotec art. These large funerary urns are beautifully designed and feature an array of deities, animals, and people. The finest of these tombs speak to the splendor and wealth of the noble classes. These tombs have carved stone monuments, painted murals, and funerary goods. These beautiful murals, though faded now, were once brightly painted. We can see a good example of this in this recreation of Tomb 105, which has a mural that shows a procession of several figures, one of whom is even singing. An important theme in these carvings and murals is the importance of genealogy and ancestry. They emphasize the deceased's connection to an important founding ancestor. Such links were likely an important tool in legitimizing rulers and reinforcing their distinct roles in society, acting as intermediaries between the earthly and divine realms. Some of these genealogies can cover centuries. A good example from Cerro de la Campana to the north of Monte Albán references at least 16 generations. These rulers and other elites also had the ability to engage in warfare, take captives, play the ball game, and make sacrifices. Now, before we leave tombs completely, I know that a few people in the audience are probably waiting for me to talk about Monte Albán's Tomb 7, because it's one of the most famous and richest tombs ever excavated in Mesoamerica. Unfortunately, we will not be discussing it today, because that tomb is actually a Mixtec tomb from the post-classic, not a classic period Zapotec tomb. It was interred long after the site was abandoned. Someday, when we cover the Mixteca, we'll circle back and talk about it. The Classic period also sees a continuation of the shift that we saw in the late Preclassic of the plaza becoming a more exclusive precinct for the nobility rather than a common ceremonial space. We can see this in the construction of high status residences on or along the plaza and the restriction of access to the main plaza. Another innovation was the construction of several temple patio altar complexes, or TPA complexes for short. These consisted of a temple platform that faced a patio with an altar in the middle. These date back to the late Classic, and they represent closed off private ceremonial spaces. This emphasis on prestigious lineages and elite ceremony and ritual are not unique to Monte Albán. Such developments were also seen in other valley centers too. These show that lineages and hereditary positions were becoming more and more important, a similar development to what we see recorded in Maya texts at this time. We also see similar TPA complexes at other valley sites, though not in the numbers that we do at Monte Albán. Now that we've got a good idea of burial customs and ritual life at Monte Albán, let's take a look at Zapotec religion. Zapotec religion has a lot of similarities to other Mesoamerican religions, and this includes the Zapotec pantheon. In the same way that the Greek and Roman pantheons have a lot of overlap and common deities under different names, Zapotec gods also have many similarities to other cultures in Mesoamerica. So if you know your Nahuatl or Maya gods, you'll see some familiar figures. In early Zapotec history, the religious motifs were informed by Olmec antecedents like were-jaguars and fire serpents. By the time Monte Albán gets underway, distinctly Zapotec gods appear in the archaeological record. The god you'll see most often by far is Cosijo, the god of rain, lightning, and storms. He's easy to identify by his protruding snout and forked tongue. Here you can see some similarities with gods like Tlaloc and Chak. Other important deities include Pitao Katsobi, who was the Zapotec god of maize and fertility, Pitao Kazana, the creator of man and animals, Pitao Huichana, the mother goddess, and Copicha, the god of sun and war. Sorry about those other ones, I could not find images of them anywhere. My apologies. Other Mesoamerican gods, such as Xipe Totec and Xutecuhtli, the fire god, also appear represented as well. Now let's shift away from the elites and look at commoners. Most commoners in the valley would have been farmers living in simple houses. Early houses would have been simple wattle and daub structures, but as time went by, houses with stone foundations became more popular. Most homes surrounded a simple courtyard. Most people living in the valley of Oaxaca were maize farmers. Like their contemporaries across Mesoamerica, they cultivated maize with beans and squash as their primary crops, but would have also had access to chili peppers, avocados, agaves, prickly pear, and other wild and domesticated plants. At Monte Albán and elsewhere, remains of deer, turkeys, dogs, peccaries, quails, and rabbits show up in the archaeological record, showing that game was still an important part of the diet. Craft production of pottery, lithics, and textiles is also very well attested among common homes, even among farmers, and some of these appear to have made excess crafts for export. Commoners also had access to foreign products, such as shells from the coast, and there's no good evidence that trade was ever controlled exclusively by the nobility. There's actually an interesting crafting legacy from Monte Albán that still continues to this day. To the north of Monte Albán, on another peak, is the site of Atzompa, a sister city that was built during the late Classic with Monte Albán-style large monumental architecture and elite buildings and tombs. Recent archaeological investigations at the site revealed a large kiln that was used to fire large vessels. In studying the site, archaeologists determined that the same complex techniques used to fire these pots are still used by potters of the local Atzompa tradition today. Out in the wider valley, there also appears to be visible craft specialization in certain communities, and there's evidence of large-scale production of some of these goods. Examples include Ehutla, which specialized in shell ornaments, El Palmillo, which specialized in products made from maguey or palmillo fibers, and the site of Tomaltepec, which specialized in producing fine ceramics which have been found at Monte Albán. Looking at these trade links as well as common architecture, pottery, and customs, it's safe to say that a common Zapotec culture and identity had arisen throughout the valley. Those other rising Zapotec cities we mentioned earlier, as well as smaller communities, were all part of a common Zapotec culture. Now, all this would change in the early 9th century. For those who saw our previous episode, you'll know that the Lake Classic was a very transformative time across Mesoamerica. Between 600 and 900 CE, many cities and states like Teotihuacan, Tikal, Palenque, and plenty of others were abandoned for a variety of reasons. The Valley of Oaxaca, and specifically Monte Albán, were not immune to this trend, and the city would be effectively abandoned by 800 CE. The causes of the abandonment are still a matter of debate. Anthropologist Michael Lind has proposed that the city of Lambayeque waged a war that overthrew Monte Albán. While it is an interesting theory, this has not been embraced by the scholarly community. Others have suggested that water sources dried up and were no longer able to support the city. Many archaeologists believe that the competition between different elite families and factions had become a destabilizing factor at Monte Albán. Others have pointed to the trend that we highlighted earlier, that elites and ruling institutions were becoming increasingly disconnected from the commoners. These commoners had helped fuel the rise of Monte Albán and had provided important labor for the city. With their dissatisfaction and departure, the nobles would have been left high and dry. It shouldn't be a surprise that noble residences and ceremonial spaces were abandoned. The ruling elite appear to have lost much of their wealth and power. I do want to point out that none of these potential causes are exclusive, and that many of them could be true. In the wake of the abandonment, the populace settled at sites old and new throughout the Valley of Oaxaca. Now, we shouldn't think of this as an end, but rather as a shift towards a post-classic world in which power in the valley would be divided between various city-states, such as Yagul, Mitla, and Zachila. Despite Monte Albán's decline and abandonment, it didn't fade from memory. It continued to be an important ritual center, and we know this because archaeological investigations have shown that people returned to place offerings such as miniature ceramic vessels, incense burners, and obsidian blades. For those with noble lineages, such rituals connected them with a glorious and sacred past. Even Mixtecs from the Mixteca Alta would later use Monte Albán as a place to inter their elite dead. Don't get the impression that Zapotec culture was in some sort of freefall. It continued to thrive into the post-classic and is still going strong today. The ancient Zapotec remain an underappreciated people outside of Oaxaca, and their emergence in Mesoamerica had wide-ranging consequences. As we mentioned earlier, the earliest remains of domesticated crops come from Oaxaca, showing that these people were on the forefront of plant domestication. The Zapotec were one of the earliest societies in Mesoamerica with writing, possibly the first, but that's doubtful. And even when the Zapotec weren't on the cutting edge, they tagged along with those who were by taking ideas from the Olmec, the Maya, and Teotihuacan and adapting them to suit their own needs and tastes. It's a real shame that in comparison to their more famous contemporaries, the ancient Zapotec are almost completely forgotten, despite all of their accomplishments and the awe-inspiring city of Monte Albán that still casts a shadow over the Valley of Oaxaca to this day. Once again, special thanks to my patrons for supporting my work. You guys are the best. If you would like to join the ranks of these fine individuals and support the show, you can do so on Patreon. The link will be in the description. An additional thanks to those who traveled with me to Oaxaca to experience many of these sites firsthand, and to our guides. It was a privilege to travel with all of you. Don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Facebook. We'll see you in our next episode. Take care.